rewilding, which is a really exciting subject, one that I'm particularly passionate about. So what I want to just do is just start off thinking about what is natural. You know, what is natural in the county that we've got, this stunning county of Devon? Well, very little, in fact. The vast majority of our county has been impacted in some sort of way by human hands, and very little would, as an ecologist would refer to as being natural. This is a view up at Marsland on the northwest Devon coast, one of our 58 nature reserves. And there's probably a small section about there that would just about qualify as being natural. Some of that coastal cliff, some of that slumped area there is there and impacted by natural processes, very little impact from people. But actually, you know, we've got rising sea levels as a result of global warming, and there's various other species which would be in that area that are an unnatural level. So perhaps even those sorts of areas aren't actually natural. So this is really important when we're thinking about rewilding, about how can we restore these natural places, bring wildlife back in a really vibrant and stunning level. This is just one view of Meath, and it's quite another one of our nature reserves, and it's quite a good backdrop to actually talk about what we think and mean by rewilding. So it's really inspired a lot of people. It enables us to think about nature in a much bigger way, about encouraging natural processes back into our landscape, helping us to combat the climate and biodiversity crisis. The crucial thing really though about rewilding compared to traditional forms of conservation is it's about letting go of the reins here. It's about putting nature in the driving seat. And most crucially, it's about catalyzing natural processes. And that's something I'm going to talk about a little bit more as we go into the presentation. It's truly inspiring, but it's also an area which is, it gives quite a lot of anxiety to some people, you know, about us actually letting go of the reins and allowing nature to be more rich and more varied. And I think at one end of the spectrum of rewilding, people are talking about bringing back very large predators, even you know, species which have been lost from these islands for thousands of years. But at the other, it's about bringing back just that vibrancy of nature, perhaps at a smaller scale. So it's the purpose of the presentation really is to introduce those processes that we need to catalyze, and what it can help us to deliver in terms of our wildlife and our biodiversity. So one of the most powerful of natural processes is what us as ecologists refer to as succession. So if you were to leave an area of grassland or a pond even, it goes on the western area of Europe, it will inexorably shift towards becoming woodland. And this is just one really good example of that. This is in Chernobyl. And as a result of humans leaving that area, clearly because of the nuclear disaster which occurred there, nature has recolonized and it is pushing inexorably towards this woodland community. And we now see wolves, bears, elk, other animals which are moving into that landscape. And it's actually one of the most wildlife rich places in Europe. And that is because nature has this amazing ability to bounce back. And one of those processes is through what we call succession. And I'll just go into that theory just very quickly, and then we can talk about some of the other natural processes. So if you were just to start with a bare area of rock and see how that moves towards a wooded community, is what we've referred to as primary succession. So those areas of rock would become weathered. They would produce some nutrients, a foothold for things like lichens. Lichens would gradually decay. They would grab dust in the air. You start then getting the sorts of communities, small annual plants, these pioneer species which are able to just get a foothold in the environment. And as time goes on, more humus in the ground is able to develop, and that soil is developed, and it increases in depth and richness. And as I say, these zones of the planet will drift towards what we call a climax community, which would be woodland. So this, it can be actually seen quite close on relatively close on our doorstep. This is actually Surtsey, which formed out of the Atlantic in 1963. And through a process of primary succession, that volcanic rock is being colonized by a whole range of different species. And this really helped along by birds and nesting birds, which are bringing guano and other things onto the island. It's now a UNESCO reserve, and it's extremely wildlife rich within that relatively short space of time. And that's showing you what nature can do from basically a situation of bare rock. But you don't actually have to go back very far in history for this concept to just not be understood. We didn't, I think people probably thought that might happen. But if you left an area here, looking up at the top right of wheat or barley, and you didn't impact it with human hands, what would it actually turn into? And the Rothamsted Research Station has been one of those organizations which has run the longest ecological experiment, or one of the longest in the world. Started in about 1850s. It was called the Beescroft experiment. And yes, they did just that. They left a field, left a number of fields, and they've continuously monitored that. And sure enough, nature colonized that area and became broadleaved woodland, and quite rich broadleaf woodland as well. So that theory is proven. And that led ecologists to think about, well, what was this country covered by? And at a time when people didn't have any more impact on the land than the beasts upon which they preyed. So this great man, Oliver Rackham, and one I studied a great deal when I was at college, wrote some tremendous books like Trees and Woodlands in the British Landscape, concluded that there were these types of climax woodland conditions. So we had wall-to-wall woodland around most of our country, and you'll see we're kind of here, well, I'm probably sat here right now on that border between oak hazel and lime woodland. So you looked back in pollen records and suggested that there was this closed canopy woodland that we had had across all of our county, or all our country. And this is often what is suggested when we're thinking about rewilding. Well, let nature go back towards closed canopy forest. Well, if that happens, these are some of the sort of scenes that we might see in our area, some of our amazing western and Atlantic oak woodlands. This is actually the Bovey Valley. So would we, when we are looking across this landscape many hundreds of years ago, seen this? Would this be of what we would have seen, this woodland stretching for as far as the eye could see? Well, maybe, but if that's the case, where do some of our most treasured habitats, where did they fit in? Where did these species manage to find a foothold? So, I have a picture here of green-winged orchids, primroses, southern marsh orchids, our wetlands, our chalk grasslands, upland blanket bog, lowland heath. Where did they exist in this closed canopy woodland? What about those species that we often think of woodland edge species, or even open habitats like barn owl, hen harrier, nightjar, ring ouzel, dunlin, Dartford warbler? You think about our dragonflies. Where were all these wetlands? Where was this space? Where was this energy from the sun for a lot of these species to survive, like marsh fritillary, common blue butterfly? So you start to think, well, actually, a lot of our species are woodland edge species. Many of them are. So where were those niches? Where were they able to survive and thrive? And this is where natural processes come in, and this is absolutely crucial. So what was influencing those woodlands to give that more open land, an open ground where some of these species were going to exist? Well, one natural process is fire. And we live in a fairly wet part of the world, and it's very difficult to burn a woodland, especially a wet woodland in Devon. So fire probably didn't have historically too much of a significant impact if you consider the closed canopy woodland. Storms, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, storms would have created open space, but would they have happened enough and with enough severity like the 1987 storms to create that dynamism and those niches? Flood, well, possibly, but we especially in Devon have relatively small rivers, and the flood zone and the floodplain are relatively small compared to the whole of the county. Coastal zones and coastal zone processes are also really important if you think about sand dunes and those sorts of ecosystems, and they definitely would have had an impact, but at the county level to support the sort of species that I was talking about earlier, probably insignificant. And then other natural processes like very heavy snowfall can actually break down trees, break the boughs of trees, and create open space. So that there was, I'm sorry, I would just talk about this. Whilst I was looking at Chernobyl and thinking about this presentation, I came across this on Google Earth. And this is what I refer to when we're talking about natural processes in terms of a flood and natural river and geomorphological process. This is the Pripyat River. That's about 30 kilometers that you can see on screen there. And you can see how much water is influencing that landscape. It is huge and significant. That whole floodplain is dynamic, and we certainly don't see that sort of impact at our county level. So there's something ecologists were missing, and yeah, that was certainly puzzling a lot of people. But back in year 2000, Frans Vera, a Dutch ecologist, came up with the answer. He said we were missing one really critical link in this process in terms of the role that grazing animals would have had on our woodlands of the past. And he suggested that we have very much downplayed that role, and that he would have seen a landscape that would have been much more open, much more like a wood pasture, a parkland, where you would have had scattered trees, shrubs, scrub, in and amongst very dense woodland as well. And actually, a lot of that history was staring us right in the face. I mean, this was a really life-changing moment for me. I recently went on holiday to the Dordogne and was able to access one of the caves where our ancestors 20,000 years ago in the Vézère Valley were painting what they were seeing and celebrating what they were seeing. And this in cases in Font de Gaume. And you just have to look and actually think, gosh, yes, there are huge herds there of species that we just don't really even consider as native to our country anymore. Tarpan, the predecessor of our modern day horses, auroch, so the ancestor of cattle, ibex there in the top left, pigs, and a whole range of other different species, bison as well. So Frans Vera certainly was suggesting we were in a situation much more akin to the sort of plains of Africa, where there were very large herds of animals which were roaming this area, keeping large areas opening and keeping them really dynamic. So yeah, in areas of Europe, we still do have some of the last populations of bison. And people have suggested that they are animals that could come back in terms of a rewilding technique. Some of the bloodlines here of conic ponies, but even our Exmoor ponies are ancient, and there would have been large herds roaming around. Pigs would have played, and wild boar would have played a really important role in creating these open spaces, turning land upside down, and creating the environments where a whole range of different species would have been able to get a toehold. And there behind our former director of Conservation in the Southwest Wildlife Trust. He did retire. He wasn't impacted by that beast behind him. But Rewilding Europe, we had the privilege of visiting some of their work in the Netherlands, and they concluded, well, if modern day cattle were basically bred from aurochs, then could you breed them back? Where were those bloodlines? And they found those bloodlines within fighting bulls in Spain and some remote herds of cattle in mountainous areas. And they've actually been able to breed back animals which have got very similar characteristics to the aurochs, and certainly not one that I would have my back turned to. But yeah, they're the potential, real exciting tool in the future of the rewilding movement. Something else to think about in terms of rewilding and the role of species is that around keystone species. So certainly all of those grazing animals that we've just introduced would have had really big impact on the landscape. But there are other species out there that are having a far greater impact on the environment than their relative biomass. You go back 50, 60 years, it was almost assumed you could remove a certain species from a food web, something else would just fill its place and the balance would be restored. And we just know that's not the case, but it's very difficult to actually prove. And one of the best ways best examples of proving that is with otters and sea otters and the fur trade. And when otters were basically nearly exterminated from the landscape, the whole kelp forests started to decline and disappear. Well, it's quite clear link is that otters were predating on sea urchins. Sea urchins love to eat kelp. So healthy sea otter population, limited number of sea urchins, and this whole ecosystem and kelp forest was associated with that. So just in that one example where one species of relatively low biomass is massively influencing that whole marine environment. And there's another. So when you're looking at trying to prove these cases, it's very difficult. Ecology is so complex. And before the time when we had amazing modeling tools, we had to look and find, well, where were the cases where we could control an environment, remove a species, see what happens. And Robert Payne, actually leading in his field on the west coast of America, referred to as a man who threw starfish. He came across in his walks and his deliberations these really species-rich rock pools. And he saw large starfish within those rock pools and thought to himself, what if I take away that top predator from that rock pool environment? What actually would happen? So you start off with these really complex environments, starfish, top of the tree in terms of the predator in that landscape. And it's feeding on a whole variety of different species, but there's quite a complex balance in there being maintained by that species. So he actually went in and got a crowbar, crowbarred off starfish, threw them into the sea, and monitored what happened. And so before starfish removal, really diverse environment. 1 year after removal, there were certain species which were dominating, and they were dominating at the expense of others. So they were species which were taking seafloor or the rock pool floor space at the expense of other species. And 5 years after removal, you just basically had mussel beds. So this just demonstrated just one predator in that system. You removed it and you had this cascade effect, which would impact a whole range of different species. And again, that's the keystone species theory is critical again to rewilding. And we've got one of our own, and one of the best conservation success stories of at least a generation, in that beavers in Devon have been given the all clear by our government, and that they're here to stay, and they're here to stay in the River Otter, and they're allowed to naturally colonise other catchments around the county. And these are one of the archetypal keystone species. Their capacity to completely revitalise watercourses, waterways and wetlands knows no bounds. They are a tremendous animal. And you just have to look at what their capacity is. We started off with our beaver work back in 2011, where we fenced an enclosure, 3 hectare enclosure, and this shows a plan view of that enclosure. Hopefully you can see my cursor. Water came into the enclosure here and left it out on the left-hand side there. We gave them a small pond, but this landscape was wet, really a wet trickle in a woodland, a small wet woodland. And we monitored, with the help of archaeologists, the impact the animals had. So within a couple of years, all of those black lines are dams that these animals have created. They have started to store all of that water in the landscape. 2013, 2014, you can start seeing how this water is billowing out from what was just really a wet seepage now into all these complex braided channels, lots of dam features, and yeah, a million litres of water which is being stored. 2015, 2016, 2017, you know, they are driving this whole wetland ecosystem. And their loss from our landscape has had really profound impacts on the health of our wetlands, but also just how we experience wetlands. Because actually, when I go to a beaver site, it looks quite alien. I think this is quite an unusual landscape. It's quite messy, but this is what we would have looked upon, you know, a couple of thousand years ago. But they're brilliant for us as well. So I'll just spend a little bit of time. I think some of you who have been on previous presentation that Jake Champ, my colleague, provided may have seen this slide. But we, with the help of the University of Exeter, have looked at, well, what are the benefits that beavers can potentially provide to flood and drought risk? So luckily at the site, we had a small channel coming in and a small channel coming out. And we were able to control that water in the blue and the water out through a V-notch weir. So you could monitor exactly how much water was flowing at any one time. And that gives you this chart below. So the red is the water leaving and the blue is the water entering. So you can see at the top here, these are rainfall events. So when there was no rainfall, because these dams are leaky, they're constantly leaking water, there was more water coming out of the site than there was water coming in. So during drought conditions, that's really important. That's feeding our rivers and wetlands with water. But the reverse happens when you get a rainfall event. So you get these huge rainfall events, far more water entering than's leaving, and it's coming in really rapidly. And it's that spike, that flow rate, which has the greatest impact in terms of flood risk. And this network of 13 beaver dams has enabled that to be ironed out. So bringing these sorts of species back into our landscapes, you know, is really complex, is really challenging, but it does provide us with not only wildlife and biodiversity benefits, but tremendous benefits from a water quality and flood risk perspective as well. So I just want to now think about what role rewilding can have in future conservation in this county, and why we really need to think about how we embrace it and in what sort of way. So we know, you know, wildlife is under great threat. You know, we are facing a biodiversity crisis. There was a State of Nature report which was very thorough, carried out probably 5 years ago or so. 1 in 7 species of the 8,500 species was deemed to be at risk of extinction. If we look historically, our woodland cover as a percentage of our land in this country, it's dropped significantly and only started to bounce back since 1900. So this partly gives some room for hope that yes, we can accommodate more woodland, but look, we're just talking about 10%. Back in Doomsday period, when this chart was, well, no, it was not produced back then, but where the data was taken from, 15% of the land area then was woodland. So it's a tiny fraction of what our country could potentially have. And we've actually started to fragment our countryside as well and our wildlife richness. And I think we can often think about Devon as, you know, very green and pleasant land, and it is a stunning county, but its intactness in terms of biodiversity is concerningly low, and in effect, the hotter the temperatures on this chart, the worse the situation is. And that's very concerning when you compare, well, actually, the situation in Somerset and large areas of Cornwall is more intact from a biodiversity perspective than our own county. And this is shown just when we look back just literally 70 years. So the American Air Force, after the Second World War, overflew some of our country, and we've got this amazing record of, of the habitat and land cover. And here you've got Bursden Moor. If anyone knows that, it's right up in the northwest of Devon. And back in those times, you can see this tremendous area, a network of rivers, streams, wetlands, swampy areas of ground with farmland surrounding it. I did some pretty quick work on GIS and thought that it's probably 50% of that landscape was wildlife rich, species rich grassland. That's present day about 10%. And that's as good as it gets. If you look at anywhere else in our country, species-rich lowland grasslands have declined in extent by 97% in the last 100 years. And we really need to focus effort on how we rebuild our biodiversity. Our species have experienced similar sort of decline. So whatever metric we look at, the patterns are very similar. So you go back to 1970, our metrics start at about 100, and most of these species are in decline. So this is our birds, bird life, this is butterflies, habitats specialists, and species of the wider countryside, respectively. The critical thing, though, is that we're always going back to about 1970s when some of the recording programs started. And that's a real problem. You know, we're going back to a time and saying, well, that was a period where we will set our baseline. But actually, we should be looking much further back as to what changes have happened. Yeah, again, here, there's the Devon Bird Atlas, tremendous piece of work. 1977 was the first iteration of that map, looking at cuckoos. And you can see how they've contracted from where they were across most of Devon, and largely now a species of moorland. And yeah, that's something we need to be really tuned into, that we don't set our baselines as 1977. In fact, the year I was born, we need to be setting them much further back and be much more ambitious. And I've done a little bit of research and thinking about, well, what actually was around in this county. And it's mind-blowing, some of the things which have been lost. And I secured a copy of this book, The Natural History of South Devon. 5 maps, 80 engravings, and 9 lithographs. A chap called John Bellamy wrote this, and it is actually a very accurate and good account of biodiversity of the South Devon area. Unfortunately, the reproduction of the map was not quite so good. But some of the species, this is South Dartmoor area, it's very difficult to see exactly where by the reproduction. Up in the top there, sea eagle, short-eared owl, so this was summer period, golden eagle, right in the center of Dartmoor, pine martin and common martin or beech martin, so perhaps two martins which are in that area. So when I'm thinking about the next generations, we need to make sure that we're not shifting our baselines. I don't want my children to be thinking, water voles, we only find those on the Somerset levels, or pine martins, we have to go to the Cairngorms, or corncrake, oh yeah, they're just in the Mackay grasslands of the northwest of Scotland. Sea eagles, again, you know, islands of Scotland, although recently, you know, they've made a comeback with the Roy Dennis Foundation and Forest England with the reintroduction in the Isle of Wight. You know, we need to think about bringing some of these species back, and we need a blueprint to enable us to do that. And we've lobbied and been in speaking with our ministers and across the movement and the Wildlife Trust movement to influence the new Environment Act. And a key element of that is about building nature recovery networks. This is the mapping work that we need to do to be able to say, well, this is where we're heading. This is what a wildlife rich landscape could look like. Where are we best putting our energy and our resources into? Other countries have done this really effectively. In fact, Belarus, where there's considerable turmoil at the moment, they've produced nature recovery network maps which are really ambitious. The areas in pink there are of national core areas of national significance, brown national significance, and so on, and all the connectivity between them. And we need to learn from those approaches elsewhere and apply them to our country. Some fantastic work that was done by Sir John Lawton, where he edited and led the team in rebuilding biodiversity, provided us with the blueprint, as it were, in terms of how we would look at landscapes and how we could restore them. And he just coined the phrase bigger, better, more, and joined. So we need bigger sites. They need to be in better condition, much more of them, and all connected up. When you have all of those components together, you start having a much more wildlife rich, healthy landscape, which is sustainable and there for the future. And we've taken that and looked at what do we need in our county? What do we need in our country to be able to have a rich and healthy wildlife for us and for nature as well? And we're calling for the area of land and the space for nature to be doubled. So currently, protected sites and what we call local wildlife sites, so these are wildlife rich areas, account to about 13% of land area. And we need to double that area to enable biodiversity to thrive. And to give you a visual indication of what that may look like, that's the equivalent of mid-Devon as a district. And I think that might make a few people think, gosh, you know, that's a huge area. But this isn't about the areas which are unproductive. This is about building biodiversity into productive land, where farmland is still producing great product, but doing so in a way which is wildlife rich, but also providing much more space for nature. And we need to cling on to our nature reserves, the 58 nature reserves that Devon Wildlife Trust has. They're absolutely crucial. We have to think of those as arc sites that are full of wildlife that are ready to populate this surrounding landscape, but reserves on their own are not enough. And this one picture shows you why. This is the fen post in Holme Fen. And that was pushed down to, in effect, subsoil through peatland at the start of when this land was managed for nature. And that's where the post is now, 15, 20 foot above ground. And that's because the surrounding land around it has dried up, has become eroded, the water table's dropped, and the whole level of that land has sunk. And you can see why. It's surrounded by very productive agricultural land, but which is impacting on the soils, the water, and the reserve itself. But there are solutions, and there are people and organisations which are leading the world in terms of rewilding. And one of the best examples is there's an Knepp estate in Sussex, led by Charlie Burrell and Isabella Tree. And I should say Sir Charlie and Lady Isabella Tree, actually. They had a couple of thousand acres of land and were really struggling year on year in being able to make a living, really, for it to break even from the agricultural side. And through their discussions with Franz Vera and others, looked at how that landscape could be rewilded. And they have mimicked species of the past with wild ponies, with Tamworth pigs, and various cattle. And the results have been astounding. The numbers of nightingales there, of turtle doves have gone through the roof. Purple emperor butterflies, it's absolutely tremendous. And if you do get a chance to read the book Wilding, it's a tremendous read. But we ourselves have spent decades of working alongside and with landowner communities in the county, away from our reserves, but looking at how we can build wildlife richness around these landscapes. And just the working wetlands and Northern Devon Nature Improvement Area in northwest Devon, in the Colm area of Devon, as we call it. Over the last 10 years or so, I've managed to restore 5,000 hectares of Colm grassland. That's a really tremendous area. 183 hectares of native woodlands, 370 kilometres of hedgerow. And really crucially, the landowners that have been working in those landscapes have been supported through agri-environment programmes. So £15 million worth of agri-environment support has been drawn down by our wonderful team of advisors to the agricultural community. Carbon capacity increased by 622,000 tonnes. So projects like this have been successful and we need to increase their scope and reach. When we're thinking about rewilding, there's one thing we really do have to rewild, and that's us. We live in a more and more benign landscape, and to us, and you know, we need to spend more time and connect with nature. And there's very worrying statistics out there that, for example, here, the distance the average child ventures from home has declined by 90% in a generation. Our children need to be able to experience nature, and not in these sorts of scenes that I've got in front of you here. You know, it's deliberately there to provoke a response. These are relatively wildlife poor. Our children want to be out there and experiencing nature, and having that thrill of and excitement, and in some cases, yeah, taking risks. And that's certainly what I did when I was young. My enduring memories of nature, my mum would be terrified if she heard too much about this, was in some of the limestone quarries of the Mendips. And it's there that I spent a lot of my childhood. And I was finding all sorts of different species, bee orchids, coming up close and personal with adders, but just like being out there and having fun and having that space, which is so crucial. And this is what some projects are doing, we're working with now. So we've just recently, Plymouth City Council have led a bid that we're partners in with with European funding. And this is about rewilding urban spaces. And amazingly, Plymouth are bringing back beavers into Plymouth. Fenced enclosure, but this is beavers in a large hectare site in pretty much the center of Plymouth, and changing the way we think about our urban landscapes, bringing much more space for nature in there, and ultimately being far less tidy than we are now. And the more this can be done, the more all people take a step within their own back gardens. Collectively, that turns into a very large area for nature. Again, we're leading a project, the Saving Devon's Treescapes, which is in response to ash dieback, which is going to have a really significant impact on our woodlands. But over the next 4 to 5 years, we're going to be planting 250,000 trees. We've just set up community tree nursery. We'll be producing at least 5,000 trees a year. We've got volunteers working and supporting us and harvesting seed outside of lockdown. And yeah, they're growing away now. So these are really exciting ways that individual people and on relatively small areas of land can collectively build up to produce a really amazing result. In Exeter, we've just recently taken on management and with partnership with the City Council of all the Valley Parks, and hectares of land this winter have just been planted up with wildflowers and wildflower meadows. Again, when you start building up these units together and allowing more nature in and more space for natural processes, wildlife will flourish. And we want to see far less of this. We've just secured funding to look into how we can enable our water to behave much more naturally. This is stuck down in a canal, concrete area, but otters move through this area. This is in Exeter. Otters, kingfishers move through, but how much better would it be if it looked like this? So re-wiggling our rivers, allowing them to break out of their concrete encasements and providing that space for water. Great for us, great for wildlife, but really tricky things to do, you know, in urban environments, but we're willing to take on the challenge. Another piece of work that I would all recommend you're looking at is about how we can take action for insects. Insects are just the real beating heart of our biodiversity, at the often bottom of the food chain. And yeah, the Action for Insects that you can visit online provides a whole range of techniques and advice and support that you can do to bring more wildlife, more insects into your environment. And we all collectively do this, it can make a huge difference. And I'll just finish just on this last slide. So getting back to thinking about the landscape scale and about rewilding. Now, these areas, this is Emsworthy Mire, looking out towards Manhattan, and this perhaps shows what one of those rewilded landscapes may look like as it's starting to develop. 30 or 40% of that area is woodland. It's really stunning oak woodland. Then you've got mire communities, upland and upland heath, and this network of trees and scrub all going through that landscape. And that's the sort of dynamism that you need to have within a rewilded landscape to bring the biodiversity back. But these are productive areas as well, and to be able to get that balance is going to be the trick to success. So thank you all. So over to you, Steve. Steve, you're muted.
It wasn't important what I had to say anyway, but apart from to say thank you, Peter, I found that very, very interesting and engaging. And I think, judging from some of the questions, our audience did too. So I'll dive straight in. We'll probably have about 15 minutes for questions. I'll get through as many as I possibly can. Some are very specific, some are more general. So I'll ask a question that I'm sure you've been asked before, Pete, and that's how realistic is rewilding in the UK if we're to continue or to move towards producing enough high quality food for what is an expanding population, and if we're to provide a secure food supply chain to that population?
Yeah, I mean, food security is absolutely critical. But yeah, I firmly believe it and see that balance can be struck. So there are large areas of land in our county which are relatively low grade agricultural land, so not the most productive land. And those are some of the areas which could continue to provide food, but do so in a way which is in a much more wildlife rich environment. So what we're not here thinking about is saying, well, let's take out grade 1, 2 agricultural land, those most productive areas. But there are quite large areas where you can adjust the balance where you still are producing high quality food, but doing so in a way where wildlife is thriving. And just one example that we saw in the Netherlands, which is useful to reference, is on the Rhine Delta, a large rewilding project at Nijmegen, where the Rhine was able to sort of burst its banks really, and to take in areas of what were quite fertile agricultural land. But those areas are grazed now, and they're grazed, and very high quality produce is coming from that. But it's done so in a much more wild way, where nature is in the driving seat and not agriculture.
Okay, thank you. So a more specific question now. This was the first question that came in. Early in your talk, you talked about succession, and the questioner asked, can this really take place with such a high deer population present in Devon? Can woody regeneration ever be achieved with that deer population at these high levels?
Yeah, deer and can be a significant challenge when it comes to woodland and woodland management. And yeah, there are lots of techniques, in terms of managing that. There can be areas which are fenced to be able to establish the woodland. But yeah, those deer, if you have these larger areas which can be established, their pressure can reduce. But yeah, what is the long-term solution there in terms of deer and their impacts on our woodland? And that's really quite challenging, in terms of, do we play the role of the predator, or do we think about, if those landscapes are well connected enough, introducing the predators? So the predator of roe deer would be lynx. I'm not suggesting now that we have sufficient woodland cover to reintroduce lynx, but perhaps elsewhere in our country we do, and they're a sustainable way of managing that population. One of the other elements of a real challenge for woodland and woodland restoration is grey squirrel populations. And right now we're looking at feasibility of reintroducing pine martens, which will have, they're not the panacea to the challenge of grey squirrels, but they will potentially reduce their populations. So working with the grain of nature is the key.
Okay, thank you. Someone's asked a question, will rewilding in some places create a nature deficit in others? So would it be that you would get rewilding taking place in a Devon or another county that seems suitable for it, and then would other parts of the UK be left to literally be, given over to agribusiness or to other uses? You might think of some parts of East Anglia or whatever. So would you get that deficit existing across the country, or would rewilding take place uniformly throughout the UK? That's
a absolutely brilliant question, and it's a slide that I removed because I thought I was going to talk for too long. 10 years ago or so took a trip to New Zealand because I'd heard about how stunning these natural places were in New Zealand within their national parks, and they are absolutely astounding and in tremendous condition. But right next door to them is some of the most intensively managed either Sitka spruce plantation or Italian and perennial ryegrass fields for as far as you can see, without virtually a tree in that landscape. And that polarization I found really difficult to cope with, and I actually yearned to get back to Devon, because it's that cultural mix of habitats which is so special. And I would I would push back very hard against a situation where, as one minister previously had put it, we'll have butterflies in the hills and beef and barley in the lowlands. It's we need wildlife throughout, and we can find that balance.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of specific questions now. Someone asked, do we have any green bridges in Devon? And do you see those as a useful tool to creating wildlife corridors?
I don't believe we do, but I would love to see them. When I travel through France, the number of green bridges that you see for wildlife to move between landscapes is just amazing to see. And we have done or mimicked versions of green bridges. There's sort of bat flyways where netting is put over the top of roads for bats to follow. But I think we need to be a lot more ambitious than that. And if we are looking at certain species, I mean, pine marten is a very good example where one of the greatest impacts on their population are our roads. Road mortality is very high. So if we're thinking about bringing those sorts of species back into our county, then it's critical that they've got safe areas to be able to cross. And yeah, I think green bridges or green tunnels something we really need to look at seriously.
Okay, thank you. And someone asks about the beaver segment of your presentation and says, is it likely that beavers will colonize the Sid Valley, which I think is a neighboring one to the River Otter, and how long might it take before they do recolonize it?
The easy answer is absolutely they will recolonize it. When we don't know. Neighbouring catchments, the beavers will move into, but they're not very good at moving over land, and they love to stick close to water. So the driver for them to move over into another catchment and actually walk in over dry land is when their population starts to expand and they're almost pushed out because of population pressure. But we've seen one individual that's moved over into another catchment. And previously it was during the trial, so we had to bring it back. But now, if that were to happen and it were to be followed, then other populations would would potentially pop up in new landscapes. And in those cases, we're already starting to work with landowners and communities in neighbouring catchments to work with them for the likelihood is of when beavers do return.
Okay, thank you. Another specific part of your presentation talked about the figure of 10% woodland cover as being an aspiration. And the questioner asks, should we be more specific in terms of the type of woodland that we're looking to create? Are some trees, do they hold a greater biodiversity value than others?
Yeah, I'd say at the moment our woodland cover in the county is a little over 10%. So we would want to double that with additional wildlife rich habitat. And absolutely, there are types of woodland community which are much more wildlife rich. And one of the key things that I hope I introduced within the presentation is the dynamism within that woodland that's really important, that it does shift and change, that there are some places which are closed canopy, high forest, but others which are, the equivalent of coppice woodlands, where light is able to reach the ground. So we also need to build in some future proofing with this as well, with climate change, and consider what species are actually going to thrive in future decades. And having a good mixture of native species is going to be crucial. But what we're really saying as well is, let's make these woodlands change. Let's have more, but have them more dynamic as well.
Okay, thank you. This question asks about, do you think that the ELMS payments, I'll let you describe what ELMS is, can the ELMS payments be used to create a rewilded farmed landscape?
Yep, so our government supports the agriculture and farming landowning communities with payment support, so rural development payments. The environmental land management payments, the ELMS, is the new schemes that the government are consulting on and developing. And part of their role is delivering the government's 25-year environment plan. And that environment plan is actually a very good document. It's ambitious, and we support it. We need a government that will properly fund and support those communities, which will help deliver it. And ELMS plays a critical role. What we need to avoid is that we have an overly prescribed system. So we need more advisors on the ground working with the farming and landowning communities to develop the sorts of outcomes that they want within their farms, rather than it being a heavily prescriptive scheme. So more locally devolved, more advisor input is critical.
Okay, thank you. And this question asks, are there any Devon-based rewilding initiatives based at quite a local level, a parish level, that people can get involved with?
Yeah, so at local levels, there are a number of projects. I think one of the best routes is to look online with Devon Wildlife Trust. I mean, Saving Devon's Treescapes is one opportunity. I think more for next planting season with the challenges of COVID that we have now. But there are various local initiatives which I've talked about Green Mines. Down in Plymouth, that's a tremendous project which is just starting. Work with more meadows on Dartmoor, where communities of landowners are working together with volunteers to create more wildflowers and more meadows on the fringes of the moor. But yeah, DWT is also extremely keen and relies very heavily on volunteers to be able to support our work in and around our nature reserves, and we would be really keen to hear from anyone who would be willing and happy to support our work locally.
Pete, I'd add to that. I mean, it's obviously a strange time for volunteering at the moment, but Action for Insects, the campaign that we launched earlier in 2019, has just launched 3 advice packs, one aimed at communities, another aimed at schools, another aimed at individuals, all of which are stuffed full of really good tips on encouraging regenerating insects close to you. So you can find those on the Devon Wildlife Trust website. 2 questions from different people, both about Dartmoor. The quick way to express it, I guess, is does Devon Wildlife Trust have a specific vision for Dartmoor? And the other person adds that a lot of Dartmoor's agricultural land is of marginal value in terms of production. Could something be done with that in terms of a rewilding project?
Yeah, Dartmoor, we don't have a specific vision, as it were for Dartmoor. But Dartmoor is a wildlife rich area. I mean, we look at the mapping where you looked at where cuckoos had contracted to. And I think often when people think about rewilding, we've got these large open moorland spaces. It's often focus goes towards those areas and thinks, oh, but those are places which would be really ideal for rewilding. Actually, I would nudge people more to the land that surrounds the edges of Dartmoor. So we've lost a lot of our upland hay meadows. In-by fields have changed radically from what were hay meadows to now often silage fields. I mean, it's some of those fringing areas that I think that there could be really exciting potential. But yeah, all of these things, yeah, I think the linking up of woodlands and allowing woodlands to move up through into the moorland areas, hugely exciting, and there is potential to do that. But there's a long cultural history over Dartmoor of commoning and management of those landscapes, and those sorts of changes, a thing we would love to have discussions about.
I'm going to just ask one last question then, because we've gone past 7 o'clock, and it concerns our nature reserves. And someone asked, does Devon Wildlife Trust have any reserves and plans for those reserves in which we would see a full selection of herbivores such as boar, wild horses, deer, beavers, etc.? I suppose, have we got any plans for a NEP-like experiment in Devon?
We have aspirations and hopes, and we would love to. At the moment, the size and scale of our sites is not quite large enough. But if we start with our approach in terms of connecting our nature reserves up, Meath, for example, with Ashmore is about 200 hectares. The excitement comes in then when you can think about connecting those up with some of our other nature reserves in the area. So yes, we are very keen to start thinking at that sort of scale. It won't happen very soon, but it's where we're wanting to head. Our nature reserves alone are not going to solve the crisis and the biodiversity crisis we're in. So we have to have that ambition and aspiration.
Okay, Peter, just want to thank you again on behalf of the audience and myself. Thanks again for a really interesting presentation about rewilding and some fascinating questions as well. So thank you, the audience, to putting those across to us. Just a couple of things to finish up on then. Tonight's presentation will be recorded, it has been recorded, and it will be posted up on our YouTube channel, on the Devon Wildlife Trust YouTube channel. We'll send you a link to that when it's ready. It will take us a few days to get it up there, but you can look at it again or pass it on to others to view. We'll be having the next in this series of seminars sometime in December, with a date yet to be fixed, but that one will be with our Chief Executive, Harry Barton, and I think that will be addressing the Devon Wildlife Trust state of play, where we look to go from here as an organisation, and it'll be also an opportunity for you to ask questions about Devon Wildlife Trust, its work and its future. And lastly, to just say to you, please remember, not that it's the 5th of November, but also to sign up for our e-newsletters. It's a really good way of staying in touch with us as an organisation during these very strange times. It's a good way about hearing about future presentations such as this one tonight. So thank you again, and good night.